Oh, there's an echo. Let's see. Test, 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 test. Okay, now there's no echo, so I'm not hearing myself. Okay, well, let's see what happens when I click off. It's still recording. Okay. Moving along. Funny when you come across features you've been really wanting to explore, have explored in the past, and come to dead ends, only to all of a sudden sort of find a quote unquote solution. So one thing that I just found interesting, blockchain. So what is a blockchain? And what came to me when I read this blockchain was immediately block as in the neighborhood block. So the neighborhood blockchain. And in sort of perceiving it that way, it's giving me a new view on this information that I'm reading. So see, what's happening right now is I'm reading this and I'm also very conscious that I am being recorded. So this is really an exercise in becoming comfortable with being recorded, and also a practice in forgetting, not being so consciously aware that I am being recorded. Because what's happening is as I'm reading this sentence, I'm thinking about that it is recording, and so I'm not really fully investing in this information, and I want to, as I do when I'm not being recorded and I'm fully engaged. Yeah, I don't feel like I need to read this all out loud. I suppose I can read, or I suppose what I will vocalize is what sort of comes through as I'm reading. Because usually when I'm sitting here just reviewing something or reading something, I'm not necessarily reading everything out loud to myself. So let me just, this is also, the intention is to approach this as I normally do. I just had a thought. Maybe this will be really interesting to review in 20 years or something. I've had that thought before, and it is always interesting. I mean, I suppose it's the digital um, tracking, the digital footsteps, if you will, that once the footstep is taken, it, I'm just going to say cannot, because I feel like there may be a possibility to, but it's nearly impossible, if you will, to manipulate that data. It, how it enters the system is how it stays in the system. So, thinking like footsteps through the snow is what the picture I'm getting, footsteps through snow, and you can go back and wipe away the footstep, but I suppose in a way there's trace evidence of that wiping away. So even when it is wiped away, it's just replaced in a way with evidence that it was tampered with, so to speak. So it's not really ever cleanly, well, I shouldn't say ever, it's just that once a footstep occurs in the snow. It's not until really the snow melts to a certain degree, or someone comes in and overhauls the landscape in such a way that the the showcasing of a footstep at all sort of disappears. But it's always recorded nonetheless. It's recorded in the the memory of the living organism that we are. So it may appear as though it's um, lost, gone, past. However, there is another dimensionality, if you will, in which it still exists. So there is a sense of linearity there, but there's also a sense of non-linearity, which is really interesting. In a way, smart contracts sounds like what we already kind of utilize, which is just a boilerplate. I notice myself looking specifically for something to kind of jump out at me, or to inspire thought so that I can continue, so that I can have something to say. I'm noticing that. I guess I could think of this as just me watching myself. I feel that like very dreamy like energy. It's very like I'm really having to pay attention. It's not that it's challenging to pay attention, it's just that I feel as though I'm paying attention in a dream. I'm also feeling hunger. So, where am I at? I really do kind of have to get groceries, so I'm finding myself wanting to do this, which is cool. I do kind of want to do this, but I also want to take care of myself. I might pause right now and come back to this at another point. So what I'm going to do is stop this recording and come back at a later point. Okay. Mm. 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 We know from research that the future of retail will be based around experiences or experiential in nature. This to me is touching on something bigger than that. It's just kind of interesting to think about what is possible when awareness around one's astrological birth chart is a resource commonly recognized. To have that as part of one's toolbox, repertoire, awareness, it's just kind of interesting to think about. There's so many other resources for self-awareness: human design, astrology, gene keys, Enneagram, various others. And so I wonder how can these resources be uh, of value in sort of developing a new sort of um, ecology, ecosystem. In a way, I have primarily been using that information, for my own relationship to the world, um, my own sense of clarity and relationship to the world and my environment and others and myself. I slowly have started to incorporate it more into just my uh, ordinary conversation, in my everyday conversation, whether it's with myself or others. Um, I'm not necessarily using it for a specific purpose other than to, I guess that's the question. Why am I using it? How does it add value to the expression itself? Do I even have, like, I don't want to I don't want it to seem like the intention is not to rely on that information as, a hierarchical, in a hierarchical way, to say better than or more accurate. It's just a different vernacular for really expressing whatever is being experienced. I suppose in a way it does tend to capture some patternistic behavior. So anyway, I just think that this is kind of an interesting thought around what is possible when there is this added depth of self-awareness included within this sort of imagined ecosystem. And what part does it play in that process of its unfoldment? I have often, and actually even now I'm thinking about it, how valuable it is for that depth of self-awareness, because it's through that depth of self-awareness where that connection to one another is more, to me, effortlessly forged. It's um because the veil between me and someone else as separate entities experiencing separate lives, having separate relationships, etc., that veil thins quite significantly, to the point where it really becomes so blended and so the experience becomes so much more universal that empathy and compassion are natural. More by natural, I just mean rather effortless default responses. It's like you can't help but see yourself in another, and you can't help but see another in yourself. Um, mm, I'm looking at this Barbara Marx Hubbard's Wheel of Co-Creation. and in my mind, seeing if there's any overlay with the astrological wheel. I don't know. I mean, I think it's pretty inclusive in general, this wheel. It's at the end of the day, I'm sort of like, I don't know how much sense it really makes to separate them out like that so much. It's helpful to a degree, but at the same time, it's also just somewhat misleading and somewhat um word words spirituality, justice, relations. This sort of gets back to what I had envisioned months ago in terms of a blank slate and what it would look like, how it would be explored in real time, in real life, within the multidimensionality of Earth living, really starting from a blank slate, past, future, inclusive in the present. And, if I were, some other things that have come to me over time is akin to a city council public forum framework where whatever someone wants to express about, they can. And, perhaps I was going to use the word implicates. Education, I'm just picking out randomly, education, media, governance as like the predominant um, contexts that are touched on in whatever it is that someone expresses about. It's not that the other areas are excluded and not related, not correlated, not part of the discussion, not relevant. It's perhaps that, education, media, and governance are the priority, but they too may be tangentially connected, perhaps even intimately connected with what wasn't expressed by that person, if you will, um, in regard, within the context of infrastructure, perhaps health, and maybe the question isn't about what is to prioritize, as in like it's a strategy and a plan and really intellectualized in that way, but perhaps it's more a question of how does this touch on everything? How does this touch on the entirety of this wheel? How do we see connections within every aspect of this, of how we experience life, how we experience and relate to life, how we see ourselves within this life wheel. How can we co-create? What emerges now in listening and perceiving what is between the lines, what is perhaps under the surface. And when we dig under the surface, we can see that all these contexts, all these areas of our experience are included, are, you know, woven within this tapestry, are, you know, founding the experience that we're dialoguing about. dialoguing on. Maybe it's in having these kind of conversations that there is a more overarching pattern that is seen, that is acknowledged. And so it becomes not so much about the distinct sectors, if you will, but it actually becomes blurred. Not blurred as in hard to see, but blurred as in it really all just merges into one overarching relationship, like felt, sort of embodied feel sense within those who are participating. There emerges this coherence, but it may not be coherence in an intellectual way. It perhaps may be coherence in a felt experience of it, of that exchange of information, if you will. And through that felt coherence, where there really is just a sense, perhaps dare I say a knowing, that space within, that felt experience, that cohered body is the blurred sort of one awareness of the unity of the experience. And then perhaps from that space of unified embodiment, there emerges a greater sort of divinely inspired insight that speaks toward the original expression in a sort of really creative way that perhaps feels unexpected, perhaps feels innovative, just not really having been intellectualized, not really having been logically deduced, if you will. It's more that it birthed and perhaps does predominantly speak toward one or a few of the sectors of this wheel than it does all of them. But there's sort of that really interesting diversification, looking at all, sort of distinctly parsing out the pieces of the wheel of co-creation, the aspects of life, and then sort of larger picture experiencing the wholeness, the unity of it, and then again kind of bringing it back to the pieces, what really speaks the loudest within that. And the intention being to walk away from that overall experience with inspiration, motivation, excitement, hope, trust. So that could be really interesting. That could be really interesting. It would be a really interesting challenge too, to inquire, explore areas of life that seem to have no apparent, like on the surface appear to have no relationship with what is being discussed. I feel sort of all right. I think I'm gonna put a pause on this for right now. This, look at. I swear I have more than one sweatshirt. I seem to be primarily focused on the financial, well, it has sort of originated as uh, the financial structure, the economic functioning, the economic framework is what has seemed of utmost priority. And it's actually bringing me back, in reading this, it's bringing me back to conversations I've had with myself, which quite honestly I haven't had with myself in some time, but I have had conversations with myself about entity structures. And I recall in those conversations feeling like the awareness I have around the sort of quote unquote standard entity structures not really landing with me, not really feeling right. I think the closest I remember them coming to feeling right was was a trust, the some sort of trust format, and that's kind of where I left it, at least. I was gonna say psychologically, but that's kind of where it left off with me in my sort of contemplation around structure at all. So it's just kind of been hovering in the background, not something that has come to the forefront for focus really until now. And not even because I uh, was intending to reopen that question mark. It more kind of came to me. And so now, what also sort of began as a financial, uh, thinking in terms of finances and financial structure and economy, is kind of broadening in scope now to just overall structure. And part of that actually is because this keeps gravitating around ownership as sort of the core structural infrastructure. And this focus around ownership and governance rights, but predominantly ownership, made me think about Kate Rayworth's donut. So in this video I was watching yesterday, she touched on these 5 factors that kind of point towards the deep design of an entity. And those 5 factors being purpose, networks, governance, ownership, and finance. And so this report that I'm reading by Transform Finance really is touching on all of these factors that narrate this deep design. And it's interesting to me how this ownership element is prioritized with Transform Finance. And it seems like in the deep design narration, they're all sort of given equal significance, but they're interrelated at the same time. So thinking about one sort of implicates all the others, if you will. But so it's just kind of really interesting to me. I love thinking about ownership and governance. It's something I touched on, geez, a couple years ago at this point, when I was rereading the book. I think it was a college book. It was a book I got in college, if I remember correctly. Or yeah, I think it was a book that I got bought in college, in studying political science. And the book was something about democracy. I have it here, but I don't recall the exact title of it. But anyway, I was rereading this book, and what sort of was coming to me at the time was this question about governance. What does it mean to actually govern? And where does governance really begin, if you will? And I was posing this question of how, well, if I want to ask the question of what does it mean to govern, what does it look like to govern, how does it feel to be governed, that the perceptions, the foundations of how that is responded to really fundamentally begins by asking and reflecting on that question to ourselves, with ourselves, from within ourselves. How do I govern myself? How do I feel when I govern myself? How do I feel within the context of being governed? So, reflecting on governance in that way was really interesting, and I'm feeling like I should probably rewatch that, see if any interesting insights come through. But it's also just interesting to me because so often I feel like when we talk about these factors or any sort of restructuring of institutional entities, we're looking at these entities as though they're outside of ourselves. And we're also looking at them very intellectually, very logically, through sort of the logical, intellectual cognition self. And while that is significant and salient, when we start to, or when I have started to perceive these entities as extensions of myself, and therefore I ask these questions of myself. What does ownership mean to me? What does ownership actually mean? How do I feel within the context of ownership? And I'm not talking about legally, according to law. I'm talking about philosophically, perhaps even metaphysically. What does it really mean? What does it really mean to own? Do we actually own anything? To some degree, and then simultaneously, no. So I just kind of am feeling like uh, that any formulation of a entity's structure is going to fundamentally have to ask these questions and reflect on them from a place very, very deeply within ourselves. What it really means within the context of who we are as divine, energetic blueprints, not necessarily as personal human identities with a very contracted sense of self, projecting onto the outer reality a perception of separation. That is also sort of what's underpinning a lot of the structural perceptions of inequity and the experiences thereof. And so, to really get to the heart of where we can find balance in these structures and safety and security and trust, there is this really looming invitation, this acute invitation to really look at, on a very, very, very fundamental level, how we relate to ownership, how we relate to governance, perceiving that relationship from sort of outside of ourselves. You know, it's sort of paradoxical to talk about going within and going to the fundamental essence of who we are, and simultaneously say, from a perception of outside of ourselves. Seems very paradoxical, sort of oxymoronic, but what I mean by outside of ourselves is kind of an impersonal, unidentified, like not really attached to one's perceived identity, structural limitations of the self. And a lot of this is honestly very experiential. Cognitively, it sounds very abstract. Cognitively, it sounds really out of reach and sort of out of touch, and like, what are you even talking about? That's not real. That's not relevant. How does that actually implicate this process, or is implicated in this process? I don't quite. It's not quite landing. It, it's a very experiential process just as much as it is cognitive. And so it's really feeling into the relationship, feeling into it. And there still tends to be something for me that when I read about these structures, on paper, they sound really great. They sound like progress, if you will. But at the same time, there tends to be this voice that's like, or this feeling that just is sort of, there's an unfulfilling, unsatisfactory feeling that's like, this is really great, and this is really this is a step in the right direction. There's more to it, though. There's more to it than this. There's a deeper aspect here that is screaming for attention, screaming to be acknowledged. I really liked how Kate's Donut really emphasizes a shift in focus away from the sole focus on growth. No matter how you frame growth, whether it's resilient growth, sustainable growth, equitable growth. It doesn't really matter what subjective label you attach to growth. Her focus is shifting away from the perception that growth is all that matters. I really, really resonate with that. And that is something that I'm actually not really, I mean, you could, in reading this report, I can see it sort of um, under the stars, uh, written in the stars, okay, written between the lines. It's not specifically stating, this is or isn't about growth per se, but it is framing this in a way that's attempting to restructure how growth is, what's the word? Not divested, not diffused. Maybe it's kind of diffused, but it's distributed. Thank you, distributed. And perhaps that's somewhat what Kate's argument, for lack of a better word, is also about. Maybe it is framing it as it's not about growth when perhaps it is to a degree about growth. It's just about how do we distribute growth. It's not saying that growth is bad, and it's not saying that growth is wrong. It's just focusing on the same sort of statistics and data and perceptions a slightly different way. This is predominantly talking about how do we restructure entities so that how they operate is distributed equally, is distributed fairly, and does so in a way that is sustainable, is purposeful, meaningful to everyone involved. And to a degree, Kate's Donut is advocating for the same thing. It's a restructuring of resource distribution by looking at ownership of those resources, by looking at governance of those resources, by looking at the finance, the financial structures flowing to and from. So it really is looking at whole system operations, management of resources. It kind of, what's interesting to me is the focus still tends to be on sort of quote unquote external materials. And what I mean by that is, the external resources, money, food, shelter, and I am by no means saying that those are not significant and valuable to the human experience. They are. Very much so. It's interesting to me how often the value of, I'm thinking metaphysical resources, but saying it in that way almost takes away, it feels almost like it takes away from their significance because it just feels so abstract. But what I'm referring to are the resources of trust and the resources of gratitude and patience and grace and many others, if you will. And those are the resources that, to me, coming back to the sort of question posed about what does it mean to own What does it mean to govern? What does it mean to manage, if you will, these resources? I'm not talking about money and food and shelter and other external sort of material resources in our physical experience. I'm talking about the resources that are fundamental to a not what does it mean to manage and operate, if you will, the flow of these resources? That, can we say we own trust? Can we say we own anything? We own, or I guess maybe better put, maybe a bit better put is something along the lines of how does it look? How do we approach governing the management of trust, governing the management of grace and gratitude? What does it mean to own the operation of our inner balance? So it's like when you start to really lean into these deeper questions, that's the place from which I would desire, that I do desire to mirror. Like, I want to see entities in the external reality mirror that, from that place, be a mirror to that place. And it's that place that feels so unexplored. It's from that place that feels like it's a whole new landscape ready to be discovered and not exploited and not extracted from, just acknowledged and, I don't know if I'd say studied per se, but observed and honored and listened to. And so it tends to just feel like we're like reaching out for some semblance um of a fix still. Like, this'll fix it. This'll really make everything better. Again, these are great steps. These are really great steps in the direction of a more holistically centered, just experience. And yet, at the same time, I just kind of feel like they're all sort of still focusing predominantly on an external reality that they see as wrong. And I'm saying they, but that's seen as wrong. That's seen as harmful. That's seen as bad. I'm not saying that it is that perception is wrong. It's just that I feel like I have, in a way, because of all the inner work that I've done to really explore how those perceptions came to be in myself, why I had those perceptions at all to begin with. And if I still really felt like they were true to how I felt about myself and how I felt about the world. And it didn't. It really didn't. It started off that way. I definitely, for a long time, felt like this is all wrong. This is really destructive in a way that can't be, like, shouldn't be. That it shouldn't be, that it shouldn't exist, that it should never have existed, with this really righteous attitude of, you know, this is gonna fix everything. This is the solution to fixing everything, the world's problems. And over time, that perception even started to change more into um, this isn't about perceiving anything as a problem. This isn't about perceiving anything as a fix. Because inherently that just kind of felt like I was projecting a judgment onto an evolution, an unfoldment that quite honestly is so much bigger than I could possibly, even in human cognition, even begin to fathom. And so it sort of started becoming this question of, like, who am I? Who am I to come along and be like, no, 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 this shouldn't be, this should have never existed, erase, eradicate, etc., etc. Anyway, I feel like I'm getting off on a tangent. A little bit of a soapbox. Soapy. Getting all soapy. Lathered up. And that's fine. I mean, it's fine to, I don't want to reject that in myself either. I don't want to reject the soapbox um, expression. I really am appreciative of this report, and albeit long, the models that they are proposing really are very creative, and I love that. I love how creative thought is, creative sort of potential is bringing a lot of this into our experienced reality. And I intend to continue reading through this and see what insight comes, because really that is, at least consciously, the predominant reason why I continue to read this, is to see what sparks of inspiration come through. But I'm not reading this to rely on it. I'm not memorizing it. The intention is not to memorize it. Whatever lands, lands. And I'm not intending to depend on this for uh, how I move forward. I'm not intending to develop expectations of how this should move forward. Just letting it sort of speak through me and speak to me as inspiration, if you will. I just rewatched the initial recording I did as sort of a test to this experience, and I'm really glad that I did, because it reminded me of the different perception on blockchain, which I believe, now this may be inaccurate, but blockchain, at least in my perception, has always referenced block as in the ledger, the block sort of information contained within something specific, contained information in a block, so to speak. And that being chain linked, that being in constant linkage in sort of almost a linear but also non-linear fashion within itself, building upon itself. And in that recording, there was an sort of a shift in perception from that kind of block to the kind of block that is the neighborhood block that we typically associate with the intimate proximity surrounding one's house is like the block. And I like that. There's something about that that I really like. There's something about that shift in perception that is landing with me. And there's this question coming through, okay, how to extrapolate that into the real world experience? What does it mean to experience a blockchain like structure within a neighborhood block? Does that translate the same? What does translate? What doesn't translate? What also shifts around? And there's this other neighborhood trusts. Now, I've heard about like family trusts. That was something that I was considering not long ago, family trusts. And I haven't really delved into the specifics of that, except I have some peripheral perceived understanding of what that would be. So it's some mix of like family trust, neighborhood trust. I have not looked into that either, except Googling it. There are some really interesting things that are popping up that I'd like to read. But yeah, just kind of like what, I don't know, interweaving these concepts of a neighborhood trust, a family trust, and sort of coming from a perception of blockchain in the sense of a neighborhood block, a community block. And I'm not saying block in a definitive way to say like, okay, here's the definitive container of this block where there's exclusivity and inclusivity sort of separated. I'm not necessarily intending that hard line when I say block. It's just the way that we have kind of traditionally considered the view of what a neighborhood block is, how it extends from the center outward. I think that could be a really interesting exploration. What precipitated this, a little bit pun intended, because it's getting dark outside. I don't know if it's going to precipitate, but it got dark and I was sitting here like, this is interesting energy. I feel motivated, but there's not a lot going on mentally. I was just sitting here and mentally it was pretty quiet, but it still felt like there was a lot moving around and a lot circulating, a lot digesting, but not a lot of specific, just not a lot of movement mentally. And so I was sitting here in that energy and like just noticing it, and and then there was the rumble up above, up above. There was thunder rumbling in the atmosphere, and that I I was like, yeah, it's that. And what is also interesting about that to me is I was sitting here a couple days ago contemplating or reflecting upon how I tend to feel motivation, feel a spark, move in a certain direction, take action in a certain direction, explore a certain direction. And then once the energy has been released, I tend to shift in in or the intensity sort of, I suppose, is released, and there's a period of rest. But in that period of rest, oftentimes there is a sort of pivot in direction. I'm not saying that pivot is unrelated in the whole scope picture of the experience of this life, just that in the incremental linearity of the experience, the pivot can seem at the time very disjointed. And that has caused me a lot of pause over the several past years, because there's this noticing and almost an immediate default frustration, because it feels as though I move and then I putter out. And it's like, and then I pivot and it's like, and then eventually soon thereafter, and so when that keeps happening, in reflection, question what is how am I to maintain any sense of cohesion? How will I sustain in a sense of cohesiveness? How am I to perceive myself as cohesive when there's all this observance of disjointedness? And there's fear in that. And there's fear in the human self being able to thrive. Or there's mental fear in the perception of, will I will I survive? Will I thrive in this perception of a lack of stability? And I'm bringing this all up because the conversation, the reflection that I was having several days ago was asking this question around what is that, and I specifically was emphasizing the word that. What is that quote unquote thing? What is it? What is that which will which is sustained, which is maintained, which continues in a sense of stability, with stability, that doesn't just peter out seemingly. Now, this is all apparent to me, apparent to the human. The human is perceiving it as petering out. The human is perceiving it as unstable. The human is perceiving it as disjointed, etc., etc. So this is the human's fear of This is the human sphere asking the question of what is that thing that will be sustained, that will be stable, that will be continuously motivating, etc., etc. And I emphasized in that reflection the word that, as in, what is that thing? And I sort of laugh. I laughed when the rumble happened, and I just was like, yeah, innocuously, sort of naively, if you will, that. And then it all came back, and I was like, oh, interesting. Maybe for the human, I'm saying for the human because there is an aspect of the self that has a whole different perspective on everything I've just said. So everything I just said as I was saying it, this other perspective, if you will, this higher perspective, for lack of a better phrase, was having a whole different conversation that was unspoken, that was unarticulated, that was unexpressed, except within this container, if you will. And so when I laughed and I recognized the emphasis on that, I sort of started wondering if that atmospheric seeming chaos, if you will, that atmospheric movement, motion, is that catalyst, is synonymous with sustainability, is synonymous with motivation, is synonymous, and what just came through is edge, 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 synonymous with what else did I say before? Sustainability, stability. I feel like there was something else. Well, anyway, but it is that continuity. There you go. I think it was continuous. That continuity. It's that motion, that movement that's not even really around me, if you will, surrounding me as though it's separate from me. It's a sense. I'm sensing into it. I'm sensing into this energy. I wonder if that will pick up on camera. But I love thunder and lightning storms as an aside. But it's that energy. That. That. Which, that electric, that really highly charged energy from which those bolts of lightning emerge. I'm glad I closed the windows. Yeah, so anyway. Okay. Time to ride the bike. I'm not sure. Is it recording? The screen? Okay. Okay. So this is testing whether I I am both recording myself in a video format as well as the screen, if I'm recording the screen simultaneously. So it'll produce theoretically two files, one of the movie that the camera is recording and then that the screen is recording. So we shall see. Okay, so let's go over to here. Okay, so I think what I'm gonna start with, because why the hell not, is an ABA journal article. If there is one that stands out to me, I'm gonna go with ABA journal, this Web of Debt blog, assuming there is an article there, and then the Troy record. All assuming there is something that lands with me, but those are the three that I'm going to stick with at the moment. That's what I'm going to go with. So I might go in that order. This Web of Debt blog, the ABA. Sometimes I can't get those articles because they are, I'm not subscribed. Sometimes I can. So let's see what we got. Web of Debt blog. I find unlikely accident an interesting phrase. It could be perceived that way. It also could be perceived that it not only was unlikely, well, that it was rather very likely. So likely that one could potentially say it was fated. That's so interesting. That's so interesting. There's that word again, accident. Accident again. What if it was perceived as fated? Like what would the dialogue around this be if it was perceived as fated? I'm not even saying that because it has to be viewed that way. It has, quote unquote, fate has to be understood, acknowledged as true. I'm not even saying any of that. I'm just kind of curious, what would the narrative, what would the conversation be like if it was perceived as a fated event? It's also kind of interesting to say we have serious weaknesses in critical infrastructure that need to be addressed. Are they referring mostly to technological infrastructure? Are they referring more to physical bridge infrastructure? Because if they're referring to bridge infrastructure, it's kind of, uh, I don't know what word to put on it, but to to frame it as though it's a really unusual once one in a million accident, and then say, oh, but it points out how seriously weak our infrastructure is. I don't know, I just kind of feel like, yeah, okay, sure, but at the same time, it's just, it feels like there's a fear of an of a of the of perceived um, imperfect system. Oh, we really need to address this once in a million uh, weakness, like showcasing of a weakness. You could say, well, we needed this once in a million occurrence to even illuminate that there was a weakness, quote unquote weakness. So now we will be able to make sure that now we need to regulate that all piles or whatever they're called, pylons, that all pylons have 360-degree security from off angle, like, anyway. Yeah, and this actually just kind of reminds me of in legal contracts how they'll have language in there that, um, if I remember correctly, the language is it, the terms of the contract are, they remain enforceable even if like one provision is deemed unenforceable. So basically, the unenforceability of a term in the contract doesn't wipe out the entire enforceability of the contract. I could look up that language, but this is just kind of what that reminds me of. Like, I don't know if they structurally engineer those bridges that way, or they have constructed them that way, because it'd be ironic if they constructed them that way to as like a because it strengthens the structure of the bridge to have it all sort of be interlocked into this one unit, so to speak. Um, but at the same time, it seems like that's what was its quote unquote downfall, like the entirety of it. I don't know. It just kind of seems ironic. Jesus. Yeah, this is the part I don't quite understand. Turned the debt to advantage by using it to capitalize the first U.S. bank. Debt securities were traded for shares in the bank. I guess that is like, I don't know, if I ask someone to, if I say, okay, will you will you pay $1,000 of this debt? So give me $1,000 that I'll put towards paying off this debt. Or rather, if you, let's just say, for example, that you have $10,000 in debt, then theoretically you you obtain from however many people, I don't know, $15,000, 10,000 of which pays off that debt, 5,000 of which becomes capital. Um, I suppose that is used to establish this entity. And then those who contributed the $10,000 to pay off, or well, who contributed the financial resources to pay off the debt and establish the bank, then are in exchange sort of they receive a share in the bank, which pays a 6% return. Interesting. Yeah, the bank then issued the first US currency, which perhaps is the dividend, leveraging its capital into credit. Right, so that $5,000 sort of established the bank, and I suppose, yeah, right. So the capital basically transformed into the credit that they then loaned out for with interest. There was the, oh, yeah, that was Jackson. That was the Jackson election. What year was that? Where the bank was extremely controversial, but it was part of his running campaign to eradicate, basically, to divest the bank of its elitist culture. I don't recall what year that was. Let me see. 1829 to 1837. Right, because that was the 1837 was the Panic of 1837, which also had to do with a like financial crisis. But it was, I suppose, around between those years that that bank, that the U.S. bank was divested, because I think it was around that time in 1829 too when the charter was also going to be up. Like something about it was expiring, and he didn't want to renew whatever, whatever. I guess its existence. So 1829. Okay, so that was still like almost a decade later, more than a decade later. Okay, well, I guess we're jumping from the establishment of the second bank in 1816 to almost a decade later when the United States seemingly is economically booming. You know, the Erie Canal was predominantly constructed or completed, I believe, completed maybe in 1828. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was, oh, that was the Marshall, right? The Chief Justice Marshall Court. Not bound strictly, right, but authority, so to speak, read in through inference. National Common Market. Yeah. 13 colonies to one market, i.e., no isolationism for states, no state obstructionism, no state retaliation, free movement, free flow of goods and services, one economy. That was the predominant philosophy of the Supreme Court during that time period. Yeah, so that infer powers of Congress as necessary and proper to effectuate. Ownership. Doctrine of discovery. Yeah, that's come up a lot lately, the doctrine of discovery. Yeah, so it was like congressional acts, interpretation of congressional acts were basically reviewed very loosey-goosey and interpreted not so strictly by the text, the actual text of the Constitution, but a lot was inferred, a lot was read in to allow as necessary and proper for this one economy basically to function and thrive. And I bet the establishment of the bank, well, the second bank, was probably part of that. I don't know what's meant by this. I've heard this term used quite a bit recently too, speculation. I don't recall at the moment what that actually is referring to. Bank, military, government leadership. Sounds really inviting. Yeah, see, this is the book. I got this book at the library. I really do want to get more into it. There's some interesting stuff there in terms of what's valued and how that value is appropriated. I'm surprised this kind of jumps over the Panic of 1837 and Jackson's basically annihilation of the second bank. Yeah, it's kind of interesting actually because these examples of how this concentrated federal bank, saved the American economy. It's like a lot these examples, World War II, the Great Depression, the Civil War, even on the towards the in the context of the American Revolution, referred to up here. It's like all of these examples are sort of in reaction, in response, what have you. I'm not saying that the bank was formed specifically for this purpose, but it just seems like the bank has predominantly saved this American system during these moments of crisis. And what's interesting is that the Jackson example, as far as I understand it, the Jackson example did not sort of come as a response to at least like sort of this existential crisis in terms of conflict, war, famine. It more was a response to elite uh, concentration of power. And that was a lot of his running campaign was basically to divest this elitist concentration of power and distribute it more equally amongst the people. And so his sort of alternative system was more geared towards state banks. So it's just kind of an interesting comparison, so to speak. Yeah, well, actually, it might be. I'm kind of wondering actually if some of the bankruptcy of these banks had anything to do with that speculation. I don't know, but I'm not saying that, you know, just having a state bank system or just having a federal concentrated, consolidated bank is right either. I don't know that it is one or the other. Let's see what we got here. Anything that I have access to? I mean, I'm kind of interested in both of these, but I guess more this one. Let's see if I can, if it'll kick me out, get booted. Oh, okay. Looks like I'm good to go. Just not looking for. There's the right to protest, but not the right to cause chaos. No. Says who? Picking and choosing. That's what it says to me. Picking and choosing what's not peaceful, what's chaotic, what there's a right to, what there's not a right to. And that to me is disorder. And I don't even mean disorder to, I don't intend that disorder mean bad or wrong by any means. It's just ironic. This has nothing to do with Biden, Democrats, Republicans. It's just so interesting to me how a a sort of objective neutral concept can be cherry picked to fit whatever scenario someone wants it to. And to some degree, that inherently feels like disorder, which also the objective, sort of neutral perception of a concept as just neutral and objective is sort of the constant order. So they're inseparable. They're two sides of the same coin. Both order and disorder exist simultaneously, and to keep attempting to box one in and say it's okay, and box another in and say it's not okay, and it's just, I don't know, it's interesting. Lawlessness. Prosecute lawlessness. Yeah, see, the usage of that phrasing, lawlessness, just kind of seems to me like it's not really hitting what it is that he's intending to say. Lawlessness to me is when there isn't that structure in place at all. There isn't a structure addressing a context, so to speak. So it's lawless. Doesn't have law addressing a circumstance. That and according to this statement, that sort of void, so to speak, should be prosecuted. It seems like what he's intending to say is what should be prosecuted is violations of whatever structures are in place addressing a specific context. So it's not that it's lawless, it's that it's law breaking, so to speak. I keep thinking going beyond the law, but that doesn't really feel like it's hitting what he seems to be intending here. So the phrase that's coming through is just law breaking, intentional law breaking. I'm not necessarily agreeing or disagreeing with his statement. I just think that his statement could be worded more accurately to fit his sort of conscious intention. It's just, it's so repetitive. Do, 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 do. The hallmark of a public service career is the promise of a dignified retirement. You would think the hallmark of a public service career is, you know, sort of aligning with one's sense of integrity. Okay, well, um, 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 um. Open streets. Interesting. Hmm. La la la. La 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 la. Okay. Interesting. Sidewalk etiquette. Tournament style bracket of sidewalk characters. Tournament style. I don't know if this is referring to the same tournament style, but that tournament style was referenced in the Vermont Law and Graduate um, um, conference symposium webinar on oh gosh, it'll come to me. Yeah, okay, it's slowly coming in. I can just about grasp it. It's like very blurry and fuzzy, but I can like sense it. Um, Antitrust, thank you. Woo! Antitrust. Okay, I think it had to do with post Civil War when, okay, I think it was post Civil War when freed slaves had um, really no money. They had no money, and so often what was experienced was the prior slave owners would would offer them a percentage of their land. So they would basically say, if you farm my land, or if you farm some percentage of this land, um, you can keep a share of the crops. Um, but some percentage, if not the predominant percentage, still would go to the landowners. And in addition to that, um, the seeds, the resources that the freed slaves would have access to engage in farming was micromanaged and overseen by these credit stores. Um, and they were the lenders, they were the only lenders in the area. And so the freed slaves were sort of constrained not only again to the land, but they were also constrained by what resources they were given access to. And I'm not really sure where the tournament style came in when that was being referenced in this talk. I just remember the tournament style being something referenced. So I don't know if it's the same tournament style that this is now also referring to. Um, what does this mean? Oh. Like, I can't tell if this is serious or a joke. Like, intended as something serious or intended to be, like, comical. Oh, okay. I get it. Tournament style. What about the senior dog walker? it's interesting because they're making these comparisons to the automobiles, and it's funny because it's the complete inverse where seniors with cars are basically booted like immediately. Like seniors should not be driving is the sentiment, and they basically get the priority for being booted. Hmm, that's interesting. Looking at walking, like looking at the sidewalk. This is what's interesting. Looking at the sidewalk as a recreational space, a commute, a commuter lane, like a commuter space, a commuter facility, as they're calling them. Um, that's kind of interesting, actually. And if you start looking at sidewalks as a commuter lane, a commuter facility, more than just recreational, because one of the other aspects, especially in Troy, where they're talking about um, redeveloping the sidewalks, they're calling them, the for the ADA, for ADA purposes, perhaps, regardless, they're referring to them as these public use ways, these public rights of way. Um, it's almost like a public throughway. So it's kind of interesting when you think about it in terms of a public throughway as simply recreational, um, and as more than simply recreational, and crossing that threshold, transcending into a space of commuting, of um, of transportation. I mean, I think that's probably a lot of why there's such. Um, but it's also interesting because in this article, they're saying, according to this tournament style, the the e-biker, I suppose the e-biker and the 9 to 5er are the only two that would perhaps qualify as commuters, like qualify under this commuter um, designation. And it's interesting because, first of all, the e-biker got booted immediately. That qualification like didn't even make it to the second round. The 9 to 5er did, but the 9 to 5er got beat out by the senior. So it's just kind of interesting when they're like they're well, I'm saying they, this total overgeneralization, but in this notion of walking is a recreational activity, not a way to commute. Um, then why isn't it that e-bikers got a higher ranking? Is it because sidewalk, a lot of street access, a lot of street use is being designated for biking? So perhaps sidewalks are sort of excluding bikes already. But that's a really interesting. It's really interesting to think of a sidewalk as more than just recreational. I'm just getting this feeling, this perception coming through of like, geez, it's so overregulated. Like it's so, it just feels so desperate to maintain order, so desperate for order. that it just chokes itself. It's imploding because of all the heaviness of the rules and regulations. I'm not saying rules and regulations are wrong per se, or bad per se. No. It's just that it's this labyrinth that is collapsing in on itself because of a desperation for order, which ties back to that statement by Biden about, I don't know, something about disorder being like unacceptable or whatever word he used. If you insist on illegally riding a wheeled vehicle on the sidewalk, like it's just so, it just feels so petty. I understand, like, I get it. I get wanting safety. I mean, it's you want to feel safe. You want to feel secure. You want to feel um understood and seen and heard and acknowledged. I get it. I get that totally. It just there there's this reliance on obtaining those of, of experiencing those aspects of life, those values, that there's a reliance on external sources, external forms of structure providing those values, giving us those values, providing us with those values. And it keeps getting more and more and more and more choking, like suffocating. And that inherently does not feel like that sense of safety and security and belonging that I genuinely feel is um, being sort of grasped for, being desired. This is reminding me of what many people say about the New Jersey Parkway, is that especially older people will say they fear driving on the New Jersey Parkway, largely because people drive the way that people drive on that throughway is can be very can be experienced as very scary for people, weaving in and out, going at excessive speeds, upwards of 80, 90 miles an hour. And um and the lanes on the parkway are actually very narrow. And so it's interesting. This is just kind of reminding me of like the sidewalk version of the New Jersey Parkway. I don't know. In a way, I kind of feel like starting to really push regulations of sidewalk use. It's so overbearing. It's so micromanagey. I get it at the same time. It feels unnecessarily over micromanaged. How else can this be addressed? And it seems like, I've been one of those people. I've had those experiences. I've been to the city many times. I also have experienced a lot of frustration with, I suppose, how people walk on the sidewalk. If people are walking too slow in front of me, if they're taking up too much room on the sidewalk, and then I have to, go out of my way on the sidewalk to move around them. Even people who are really uh, moving quickly, and they're moving so quickly that they, I don't know, bump into me or cause me to move out of the way, and that maybe I'll trip or whatever the case is. And so, I mean, I've experienced these frustrations and annoyances and quote unquote sort of recklessness um, in relationship to other people on the sidewalk. And I'm not saying that I don't continue to experience that, because I do. It's just that in moments where I feel that surge of discontent, I bring myself sort of back to myself, and I'm just like, why is this so upsetting to me? Like, I'm not talking about situations where, there's potential serious sort of harm and injury. Um, there's a spectrum, but at the same time, I suppose I'm just kind of wondering, why is it so triggering to me? And how can I address it in myself so that I am more able to remain centered in a a peaceful experience, that I'm unbothered by this, that it doesn't have that kind of power over me. How can I address that? Oh no, it wasn't that. It was Sammy's Law. I'm interested in this paving the way for New York City to finally set its own speed limits. I don't, is that saying that it's um, a more localized authority as opposed to the state authorizing that? That's what I'm curious about. This is making me think about the recent open house the other day from regarding I think it's the DOT, Department of Transportation, Reimagine I-787 um, project, in which many of their proposed designs um, of that corridor include a reduced speed limit to like a Broadway. And I remember one of the, well, information that I heard was that what that meant was from, I believe it was 55 miles an hour to 35 miles an hour. And so I'm wondering, actually, first of all, I don't know if 787 is considered like a state highway, a county highway, a city. It's not just specific to Albany. It's Albany, I believe Menands, Cohoes, perhaps. Um, but it's interesting, if New York City is asking basically for the authority to reduce its own speed limits, I'm wondering how that implicates the reimagined 787. Or they just have to ask the state for permission. I don't quite understand what the law is. to set speed limits. Support giving New York City the ability to set speed limits. Okay, so I guess it lets the city lower its speed limits. Albany still controls the city's ability to set speed limits on its streets. This means that even if a street is known to be dangerous, the city has limited ability to make it safer by changing its speed limit. When it passes, we can add lower speed limits near schools, senior centers, dangerous intersections, and other spaces to ensure our streets are safer. Speed cameras, that's something that's been coming up a lot in Troy around buses, having buses equipped with speed cameras. Maybe there should be speed limits on sidewalks. Interesting. I'm still not really sure how, like, I'm not sure what the state legislation is around setting street uh, speed limits, especially in relationship to individual cities' ability to do the same. And also where the county fits in. I'm not really sure how that relationship works or what that looks like, but okay. Well, I guess I'm gonna put a halt here and see how we did with the movie recording and perhaps the screen recording. So, yeah. La 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 la. You wagging your tail, Bean? Do I even call that a wag? Oh, oh my gosh. That is silly. Oh. Yeah, you like that runner stuff. You like it so much, Bean. Yes, you do, Tata. Yes, you do, Tata. Let's make sure. There's always tomorrow. Let's get it going. Who are you, Steve? I know I'll find you. I know it. A little strange. Yeah, I appreciate the passion. It's just, it's so interesting to me how this kind of sentiment echoes what I imagine the sentiment was at the time of the founding of Troy. It's all sort of an echo of the past, couched in a very sort of future looking perspective. It's I just kind of feel that resonance of the founding 200 plus years ago. Couching it in this phrasing, this kind of narrative about challenging any farmer's market, and this isn't the first time I've seen, Troy is going to be the leader, and just this air about it that's like, we're going to be number one. And to me, I appreciate the passion. I just wonder, does it have to be competitive? Competitive in a way that's a little bit hierarchical, um, a little bit comparative in the sense of I'm comparing my success to how I how I compare to the next town or this town or this town, or even comparing myself to my past, so to speak, my past version, and to continue to look and perceive myself and relate to myself and relate to um, towns in my surrounding environment or just within the larger picture in that way that feels kind of competitive, that feels kind of like seeking to have a leg up. It is not necessarily the only way that this has to be narrated. There's a certain energy to it um, that feels a bit, and this is going to sound a little bit extreme, but a little bit desperate. Um, let the farm, and the thing I really appreciate about this article is that, it's to a degree allowing the farmers market and the participation in the farmers market to speak for itself. It is speaking for itself, especially when in the environment, when engaging in the environment in real time, in person, so to speak. It speaks for itself. There doesn't have to be um, this narrative, this competitive narrative. I almost feel like that just um, dampens the beauty of what is already present in the atmosphere.
Comes through when it comes through, am I right? um, Sitting here eating um, my oatmeal, and I just kind of had this realization come through about the commentary I made around um, the mayor's commentary about the Troy Farmers Market and how the way her statement framed a narrative sounded to me like um there was support for a rather competitive nature. Um and so as I was sitting here, I sort of had this realization come through um about how I was exemplifying I the point I was trying to make, or the point I was bringing up, so to speak, what I was talking about. I was essentially exemplifying that point in real time because I I started asking myself just now, um, if that was necessary. And I was asking that because it felt to me like perhaps I was coming across a bit judgmental or with a bit of criticism. And I started asking myself just now, was that necessary? Was I going into reading that article looking to quote unquote sort of pick a fight? Going into it with this desire to grip onto the first thing that stood out to me as quote unquote wrong, or just something that I perceived as um, wrong, for lack of a better phrase. And I'm not saying that that was wrong. um, just that I asked myself, is that is that my intention going forward? Is that what I desire my intention to be moving forward in how I relate to the world, how I relate to myself, how I relate to others, how I relate to stories and narratives, because that feels like, in reflection, that has been the predominant perspective I have gone into relationships with, is, and even that could be very subconscious. It's been very subconscious. I haven't even really been aware consciously that I was behaving that way. But I'm noticing it more and more, especially this morning, after concluding that recording. It sort of stayed with me. This energy sort of stayed with me of a bit of insecurity. And so I just sat down and was eating and sort of just kind of started asking myself this question of, because I knew what it was around. I knew it was around that sort of approach, that sort of response to the story, and being critical in that quality of critical, where I was just looking for something to talk about in a critical way, in a way of judgment. And whether or not that's how it came across, that's how I felt afterward. And so in doing this reflection just now, I was like, okay, wow, was my response, quote unquote, necessary? Was my response, um, you know, sort of exemplifying what I was commenting about originally, which was her comment necessary? Was her comment, um, a framework that I guess I'm not really sure how else to put it at the moment. It was something that I questioned as, is framing a narrative in a way that supports a competitive nature, where there's conflict, fighting against one another, standing above one another, comparing ourselves to one another, saying, I want, having this goal of being number one. Is that a necessary narrative? Is that the narrative that we want to continue supporting and encouraging? And so now I'm asking myself, is the narrative that I was expressing, is that the narrative that I, moving forward, want to support, want to encourage in myself? And to a large degree, no, it's not. So I just wanted to sort of interject this here, because I'm finding it kind of funny, quite interesting, and I don't know, I suppose a bit informative to myself. So for future reference, yeah, yep, life tends to mirror life. That mirror is staring me right in the face. What I would also say to myself is, it's okay. It's okay. It's okay that there is this pattern of behavior arising, because it's not surprising that after generations and generations and thousands of years of this similar or a similar pattern of behavior being inherited within the cultural, societal framework, so to speak, it's not surprising that it continues to arise within myself. And there's a lot of processing that has been happening to move beyond this pattern, to see it as not an absolute authority, but an edge to transcend. And it's okay that it continues to arise. It's not a pattern of behavior that I desire to identify with as an absolute definition of who I am. And so, in that, there is gratitude, because without the awareness of it, without the recognition of it, it would be so much more challenging to consciously, intentionally transcend and, excuse me, work to embody more fully, to integrate and embody more fully a different pattern, an alternative pattern that is forgiving, that is grateful of just the experience and what arises therefrom, and to be able to empathize with that experience in others. And so, from that vantage point, so to speak, I look at the commentary, the original sort of commentary I was commenting on, and just seeing it with a different lens, and being able to feel more in the body that sense of gratitude and trust and patience. And so, yeah. It's okay. It's okay.
Decimal notation? Is that rotation or fraction rotation? Ooh. Itchy, itchy eyes. May 8th is walk, bike, and roll to school day. Come on, roll on in. I don't think I've ever seen a biker on a cell phone. Although I suppose maybe they've had their had earbuds or whatever, earbuds. Next, two articles, blah blah blah. Very pretty. I don't know, this state local partnership. I'm curious to see how much more often we see this phrasing, state local partnership. First, well, not first, but it's been private public partnership, state local partnership. This is by no means intended to criticize, judge the framework of partnership and the intentionality of partnership. I feel that there's something else going on here. So I'll be interested to see how much more that phrasing comes up. Third and Fulton. Third and Fulton. Here we go. Right. Yeah, this building. This is now a big parking lot. I just took pictures actually. Um, about a week ago, a week and a half ago, a little over a week ago. Yeah, I took pictures here because I really see this space. Interestingly, a week and a half, or whenever I took those pictures, I was taking those pictures because I wanted to see. I wanted to explore the possibility of moving the another very beautiful, prominent historic building to this space um, to act as a new city hall. I am not 100% sure on the square footage of this building, this other historic building I'm referring to, but I had taken pictures because I wanted to artistically improvise on the open space. So this garage isn't there right now. It's been demolished and this is all just open space here. And so to artistically design having in mind that other historic building and sort of plopping it artistically in this space to act as the new city hall was an option I just was playing around with in my mind. And to have it drawn out on paper, inspired by some pictures of the space, I thought would be a really great just exercise. So it's interesting that they're now this gentleman Don is referring to this Freer building, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Free Freer Freer building. This building actually just became well. This first level, I don't know about these upper floors here, but this lower level just went vacant. There had been a an antique, uh, mostly furniture, but an antique business that rented the space, and I talked to the woman back before, it might have been before Christmas, and she had mentioned that they were moving spaces. And so I just saw that this space became vacant probably over the last 2 weeks or so, 3 weeks maybe. Um, I am unaware of the intentions for this space, who owns the building. I actually am not sure. Maybe it's Bryce who owns the building. Yep, Bryce. But the interesting thing about that too is, you know, from what I understand in listening to the mayor's administration, they don't have any intentions of um, renting space for the city hall. They want to own the space. Based on what I understand thus far about the intentions of the administration, um, I mean, it's a cool building. It really is very beautiful. Architecturally, it's stunning. Um, all very interesting. And here's the atrium. This is actually where the that other article was talking about that houses the Troy Farmers Market over the winter. It's in this building, but I suppose there's also talks about this building being sold. Uh, Actually, I think Bryce might also own this building, this atrium building. Maybe he just owns the block. The um the RFP for the new city hall, I believe, if I remember correctly, they were looking for at least 30 to 40,000 square feet. Perhaps, that clock is really cool. Um, Perhaps that'd be good for them. So, all very interesting. Very interesting. Let's see what else we got. 2-year full cost of attendance. I'm unfamiliar with scholarships to know if that's usual, standard, to have the full cost. I mean, I suppose. I don't know. There's something odd to me about this, though, in terms of the state, the state basically subsidizing scholarships. Is that usual? I'm really not familiar enough with the scholarship process program. Is it usual for the state to sponsor that through specific outlets? Outlets being certain institutions, educational institutions. Like the state is sort of controlling the flow of where students go, how students get funding, the programs, and within that, the educational material taught. Something just feels very off about that. I mean, I get that SUNY and CUNY and New York State accredited colleges, I suppose, have some um, connection already with the state. It just seems, I don't know, the whole framework just seems really bizarre. There's something really off about it to me. It almost just feels like an educational factory. Yeah. Recipients must agree to work in an underserved area for 2 years upon graduation. It feels so contractual and controlling, micromanaging. It's almost like scholarships to me used to be predominantly associated, at least in how I perceive them. I perceive them as rewards or awards for based on merit. And what I mean by that is just based on a student's particular unique experiences in life and how they showed up in those experiences, how they responded within those experiences, and how they responded in those experiences said something that educational institutions wanted to support more of. They wanted to support the expansion of. And so the scholarship was really a recognition of the individual's, I say, abilities, capacities, goals, like direction, but sort of it's an encouragement, a recognition and an encouragement for the student to expand their responses to life. But here it almost kind of feels more like it, uh, especially because they're saying randomly selected. The scholarship recipients will be randomly selected through a lottery drawing. So it's like it's not even about, I mean, maybe getting into the pool of recipients, perhaps there's some degree of, you know, filtering based on how how students have shown up in certain experiences in life. So maybe that gets them through door number one, but then the scholarship award is random. And so it's random and for a specific and controlled in the sense of what the scholarship, like how the scholarship can be used, how the scholarship can be acted upon, whatever. So there's something about it to me. I mean, that it's less about the student. It's less about um, their talents and skills, and it's more about, you know, it's less about supporting the students and more about controlling a marketplace, controlling the labor for a specific field, which is why it feels so factory like to me. It's like the labor force, the labor to uphold, to support this factory machine isn't where we need it to be for production purposes. So, therefore, we need to put in place a mechanism to make accessible more labor, um, to keep this factory running. In a way, what just came through is the analogy of um, sort of the mid 1800s, late 1800s, when there was a very large influx of immigration from Italy and Germany and um, maybe Denmark. I mean, all over, but I'm specifically remembering the Italian immigration stories about what were they called? Pardonis, perhaps. I might be incorrect about that exact terminology, but they were people hired by certain manufacturing plants or manufacturers in the United States. And I'm not saying that this is wholly, exclusive to the United States, but there was a predominant um, experience of these people who were hired by the manufacturing companies to specifically go to Italy or perhaps other locations and specifically entice people of those areas to come to the United States um, with the intention of putting them to work in these manufacturing companies at low cost. And that intention was not translated to the, Italian immigrants or who, other immigrants that were part of this scheme. But it just kind of reminds me of this, we're painting it as a really beautiful picture. And I'm not saying that that beautiful picture doesn't exist, because it does. It's just the way that the communication frames, it's the narrative of the communication that is not being fully transparent about what other intentionalities and motivations are supporting this presentation. And so, yes, I mean, the way that this funding is being presented is rainbows and butterflies for students who genuinely, desire to move in the direction of the medical field, registered nursing, whatever else is included here. So there are people who would look at this and say, "Oh wow, this is such a great opportunity. This is exactly the field I wanted to go into, and I can get a scholarship for it. Seemingly 2 years fully paid tuition and assistance with room and board. I mean, that's a winning package." I just sort of see this as um, a ruse. And again, that's not to say that there isn't a beautiful picture here. And there's a beautiful picture that even goes beyond this sort of more narrow beautiful picture, this more focused beautiful picture. There's an even grander beautiful picture beyond uh, the walls, so to speak, of this um, specific story. And then they use words like empowering. And I just kind of question, what does empowering mean to Governor Hochul? And this is not just about Governor Hochul, but just because she's part of this story, I'm curious, like, what does empowering mean to her? What does empowering mean to those who are managing this scholarship program? What does empowering mean to the staff, the teachers at these institutions who are also part of this program? Well, what does empowering mean to the students? Because it's easy to throw around words, especially words that are often being used in different narratives. Um, and they're catchy and they're inspiring. So they have a certain energy in them, um, you know, just in and of themselves. They have a certain sort of resonance. But what does it really mean to those who are relating to it in the moment? Excuse me. Yep, by working together at the state and local levels, state and local partnership, complete program rules. You must follow the rules. You must. What's going on today? Sort of an odd picture. Another dual admission agreement. Interesting. SUNY Adirondack, New Albany. The last one I saw, I believe, was, oh gosh, I think it was the county college here, Hudson Valley Community College, and maybe U Albany. I don't. Oops. Yep. U Albany and HVCC. Now it's U Albany and SUNY Adirondack. Yeah, I think it was similar where the students would be accepted to both colleges, earn an associate degree from HVCC, and transfer to U Albany for a bachelor's degree. I believe that's the other one. Blah, blah. But when a society, mind you, not only a government, is so stuck on archaic rules, bureaucracy, regulations, it suffocates completely such creativity. Indeed. I feel like I was talking about this the other day, the like choking out such strict um, structures, really choking out and imploding on itself, or choking out its own breath of life. Merit is an interesting thing. How do we even relate to merit? What does merit mean? What does merit feel like? What does merit look like? How do we interpret merit? How do we interpret whether there is or is not merit? Part of this, I mean, yes, we say archaic rules and regulations, but it's also, to a degree, perspectives. And I say archaic here, not just in the sense of um, age, but in a sense of meaning, in a sense of um, hmm, how just how it feels in relationship to it. So when I say archaic perspectives, they're perspectives that perhaps at a point in time, so to speak, they had more substance. They landed in a way that at the time perhaps felt more right than it does today. Um, it just there's this sense of hollowness, a sense of feeling not well in relationship to it, like it's toxic, it's life draining. And this isn't new, so to speak. It's not as though um, it may happen all of a sudden that there's realization of the toxicity of something, and toxicity feels dramatic. But there is a sense of um, this doesn't feel in support of of thrival, of growth, and even in saying that to to live is also to die. They're inseparable in that way. Um, to grow is to grow and decay and die, and then from that material, that decayed material, it is recycled and renewed and grown from again. That process is continual, and perhaps we have a tendency of seeing only life or seeing only death in that absolutist way. So when I say archaic perspectives, it feels like perspectives that are in decay, perspectives that are in the decay aspect of the process, so to speak, and are I'm very hesitant. See, this is the thing for me, because when I start going down this contemplative road, so to speak, of decay and growth, I hesitate to say what I really want to say, which is that in that decay process, the material present is less capable of um, vitality in that process. I'm not saying in the, more broad recycling process. In the decay, there is less um, vitality. There's less internal ability to grow. And I know it sounds so obvious in saying it, but there's something about it that's like, just let that process happen, just let the decay happen, not without this, without a projection of control, of a need to control onto it to say, no, it's not okay that you're in decay. It's not okay. I don't want to see that. I don't feel comfortable with your decay because I don't know how to relate to it. I don't know how to adapt to it. I'm afraid of what it's going to mean for me that you're in decay. And so there is this fixation on the decay not being okay. And the hesitation that I have in framing it in this way is because in my mind, I always have this analogy of adult, elder, so to speak, humans, and how challenging it is to take this framework, take this perspective, and plop it onto the human experience. I say this with a grain of salt, and for lack of a better phrase, plop it onto the human experience in decay. So the body sort of in decay in the sense that the functionality of the body's processes, the body's physical capacity to generate life, to generate vitality, to generate growth, so to speak, to be that material, that soil, that earth, supportive of new growth. It is in decay, and for the human relationship to that is very touchy. It's very sensitive, very emotionally charging. So I hesitate for that because I experience that just as much as many others, and it's challenging for me to feel a sense of peace within that. But for now, sort of setting that aside, when I going back to this archaic perspectives, I just am sort of speaking toward these perspectives that are in decay and sort of have just a hollowness to them. They have this sort of lack of fecundity where um, they're not generating new life. They're continuing to generate decay, if anything else, which in turn will generate new life. But I suppose in the immediacy of the moment, what is perceived is and experienced and related to is more just decay of the decay of life bearing. So it's kind of coming full circle now, coming back to what's being said here. It's cultural. Where was I coming from? Right, because I was talking about meritocracy and how one makes a determination. Oh, there is merit here. There is not merit here. In that very bifurcated, not bilateral. What's the word? I know it's there. By something. No, not binaural beats. Oh my gosh. Anyway, it'll come to me if I just let it go. Yeah, I kind of feel like I lost my train of thought there from where I started, but it happens. It happens, I say. It happens, I say. feeling hunger. Until next time. I'm having this feeling of being more than anything the objective observer.
Statistics through flashy ads or digital connection in some way. It really is just humans learning how to work out problems together. And I think that's the practice we have to revive. So Asimov was a brilliant writer, but it's a nightmare because that has nothing to do with the practice of democracy. That have a legal basis, that are connected in to our parliaments, to public administration, have a relationship with civil society and other stakeholders as well, and play a really ongoing role kind of expanding our democratic architecture. Served on 3 juries a year. So you kind of think of a world where 3 times a year you are given government power and you're asked to make a really significant decision. That would radically change your conception of your role to the government. And actually, to me, the role of a facilitator is crucial. And more people, I think, need to have those kinds of facilitation skills. So actually, how could we be training more people to have those facilitation skills rather than thinking about, well, we could be using AI to facilitate? Maybe possible, but my question is, like, is that desirable, and is that going back to the problem that we're interested in solving? And I think if we could get to a world where 3 times a year we were called into some decision and we made it and it had a consequence, we could see in the world what the consequence was, that would be magic. That's the elixir of democracy. Like if we really felt, and not just white male property owners, right? All of us felt we were part of government decisions, and those, and you don't have to agree with them, it's just that we're part of them. And we have a chance to understand them and make a decision on the basis of it. That's the practice that I think we need. Being infused all over the place, not just waiting for that one national citizens assembly in government is what is. Okay, thank you.
Well, that was interesting. I mean, there are some interesting points. I'm sure there's going to be more reflection as time goes on, as there typically is. But yeah, I would say some interesting points that were touched on. Even that last point about sort of delegation of sort of decision-making authority and what is delegated and what is perhaps more significant for collective participation. I suppose there is something about it that feels, forward-looking in the sense that it is embracing innovation in institutional structuring, and that is definitely, to my sensibility, something that is going to be very prominent, more so than it already is. And I suppose I question how much of that shift in institutional structure will be through implementation of these strategized. Now, I say strategized, I suppose there's also experimental they're experimental in nature. Um, I suppose that's part of the innovative quality. I guess I'm curious how much of that institutional shift will come from sort of this kind of externalized um, maneuvering, so to speak, in juxtaposition with more of an internal manifestation. And I say that um, loosely to mean kind of rather than looking to implement from the outside in, it's more um, an alignment from the inside out, sort of an organic outcrop, so to speak, of an internal reflection of one's own sense of authority in themselves and in their relationship to themselves, their relationship to the world, their relationship to each other. And when that kind of relationship is really reflected upon deeply, that creates or um, sparks a transformative shift within one's perspective of reality. And in that shift in how reality is perceived, there just is this effortless, and maybe that's a more accurate word, um, even than this external kind of sourcing, so to speak. But it feels effortless. It just feels more organic in that sense. And it's not to say that a more externalized implementation is not organic. Um, there's just a different feeling of quality. There's just a different experience coming from sort of more of an internal outward unfoldment and evolution. And I also recognize that there is not a separation, so to speak, between the internal perception of reality and the external experience of it per se. So, even even in envisioning and experience the internal out, there is still going to be an outer external quote unquote manifestation of that energetic match. So it's not to say that external outer implementation is going to be non-existent, so to speak. Just that I guess what I'm saying is that there is a significant aspect within this whole process that is the internal aspect. It's the internal reflection. It's the questioning, having your own citizens assembly within yourself. What does that look like? That would be an interesting question. That would be an interesting question. If you had a citizens assembly with yourself, and the citizens assemblies are, or the citizens are all the different angles, all the different perspectives that one can have around a particular issue. And so practicing having a citizens assembly with one's various perspectives sort of um, um, challenging yourself to even listen to acknowledge and recognize other perspectives, and then challenging yourself to really listen to them, not necessarily agreeing, but listening to them fully, sort of stepping into that perspective. That would be a really interesting exercise. I'm also interested in what was mentioned about conversation mapping. Someone in the comments posted conversation mapping, composting, and harvesting, which is a word that that really stuck out to me. I think it was earlier actually when I was looking through the record, the newspaper. I don't know. It was either yesterday's or today's, talking about the hunting season, the deer hunting season, and using the word harvesting um, in that context. And I specifically remember saying that word harvesting felt really bizarre to me. That was a very bizarre usage of that word. So here it is again, harvesting. So that was interesting. I'm perhaps going to look further into that. The other thing that I found interesting was mention of this polis technology. I'm not sure, perhaps this is a platform of some kind. I Googled it. Polis is a real-time system for gathering, analyzing, and understanding what large groups of people think in their own words, enabled by advanced statistics and ... I'd have to go to the website to find out more. But there was this polis, if I'm even pronouncing that correctly, technology, implicit mind. Implicit mind is an interesting phrase. I've heard this phrase before, implicit mind, but I'm interested in uh, further exploring that. So perhaps, like I said, more will come, more will arise for exploration, but yeah, so until then, or whatever, I think I'm gonna call it for now, so peace. Because why not? Woo! Doing the thing.
For joining us today. I'm Brittany Segundo, a program officer with the National Academies, based on the synergistic combination of models and data. It's that bidirectional flow of information between the real-world system, be it natural, engineered, or social, and its virtual representation that allows the virtual representation to evolve with the system. So, for example, digital twins raise issues of ownership, control, access, and agency. They raise issues of fairness, equity, bias, and the potential for injustice. And by fairness, we mean ensuring equal and just distribution of both benefits and costs, and that individuals are free from unfair bias and discrimination.
La.
So far, so good, I think. It all sounds very lovely. But is it?
Whenever we are using any kind of electronic tool, whether it's AI, digital twins, or traditional risk prediction modeling, we need to think carefully about where the data came from and to what extent biased systems that give rise to that data may lead to inaccuracies or other sources of bias and unfairness in our results and in the models that we generate. Are less likely to receive recommendations for high sensitivity biomarkers or detailed medical. I feel slightly embedded in that question is the assumption that acceptance of digital twins is a positive thing. And so sort of following on from the last question, what I was thinking is, at least in medical research, we make a lot of assumptions about what is a positive outcome and what's a negative outcome, or what preferences patients might have for a particular outcome or intervention and so on. And I think the thing that's like the most important is to make sure people understand what their options are, and then that they have access to options that are concordant with their goals and values.
I personally don't like the distinction between hard skills and soft skills, because the quote unquote soft skills are pretty darn hard to do them well. So I think this is going to be essential to the future of successful academics. I hope that's the case. And then we were at the National Academies on a visioning meeting around spatial technology, spatial science. And the same question came up, and a gentleman from Google stood up and said, privacy is dead. Why do we need these privacy laws? And all the women in the back row stood up and said, no, we need these privacies.
I'll see you next week. Thank you so much.
A lot. Quite a lot. Okay. Quite a lot. Lots going on internally throughout that webinar, but I kind of thought maybe it's better if I just focus on listening and what's being said, what's being shared, be open, as open as possible to just letting that information come in, seeing what lands from here on out, so to speak, and yeah, just going with the flow of that information. So really interesting, quite a bit, quite a lot, and I'm interested to know in myself or observe in myself, through myself, what comes through in connection with that digestion process. So there's been a lot of consumption. Now there's going to be a lot of digestion, and we'll see what comes out.